It's really great to be here. I'm really excited. I thought I'd kick things off today by telling you all about an image I recently saw on the internet. Figured I'd end my career today in front of you all. This is some really beautiful stuff, quite frankly. This was actually created back in 2012 by a history professor named Ben Schmidt. And I love this. It's really abstract, it's compelling, it's static but moving. It almost feels a little bit like a snapshot of smoke. The thing is that this image isn't just a clever bit of abstract fluff, some clever bit of self-indulgence. You see, Mr. Schmidt actually specializes in visualizing data, specifically so it can better help him understand the history of the 19th century. So the image that you actually see was taken from 2 centuries of maritime exploration and ocean journeys, and all plotted, traced out, and then overlaid on top of each other to create one single image. So the result is this image that you see up in front of you. More than 200 years of human exploration on the seas of our planet, collapsed into a single frame, compressed into a single image. The thing is, what's even more moving is the time-lapse version of this image actually being drawn. So this is basically showing every ship's journey for every single month, beginning in 1830. So each fleeting or dancing line that you see in front of you is actually one ship's journey. Their port of origin, their destination, the countries they stopped at along the way, and how long it took them to reach it. The countries they visited, they explored, and then eventually returned to. Some of those ships never actually returned home. I mention this because human history, in a very real sense, is actually formed and founded on exploration, of not being satisfied with where we are and trying to move to somewhere else. We're moving from one destination to the next, and we're always looking for direction. And sometimes we don't actually have it. I mention this because I think in a very real sense, the digital industry is actually founded also on exploration. And this has been brought into sharp relief for me in the last couple years because the one question I hear more often than any other when I'm starting a project or meeting with a new client is, where are we going? What's happening next? And there's a little bit of fear behind this question, right? Because I think in the last 6 years alone, we've just seen dramatic levels of change in our industry in a very short period of time, right? I mean, mobile traffic has exploded. There are some estimated 8 billion mobile devices in use on the planet today. And ever since the introduction of the iPad, tablets have become sort of the next emerging wave in the mobile landscape, with some 80 tablet devices being introduced in 2011 alone. And now, because we're sort of anxiously trying to figure out what's next, there's a lot of experimentation in the post-screen landscape, investment in smart TVs and wearable computing and smartwatches. We're always trying to look down the road to figure out what's happening next. And I don't think we have a clear answer to that. But when a client asks me, where are we going? I can actually just point to one change in my work that I think has been pretty dramatic in response to all the changes that we've been seeing in the device landscape, or at least as a responsive designer. The big change for me has been moving away from this idea of pages as the singular organizing principle for our design work on the web, and moving into small reusable chunks of design, or patterns. In other words, in the old days, we used to create these abstract grid frameworks in something like Photoshop or Illustrator. We'd create a system of columns and rows, and then we'd sort of populate it with stuff, right? We'd sort of fill that canvas with the information and the content that we're actually designing. And I think now we understand that our work actually begins a level below the page, by understanding how each one of these individual modules and patterns changes and adapts, maybe independently of the other patterns around it. And it's by doing so, by creating these small little responsive designs, that we can then stitch them up into some greater whole to create more nimble, more pattern-driven responsive designs. I mention all of this because this has, maybe even more than mobile, been the single biggest change in my design practice over the last few years. It's impacted nearly every aspect of my design process. It's changed the way that I think about designing information for the web. Let me give you a very simple little example. I had the pleasure last year of working on a redesign of the Toast with Karen McGrain, who's going to be closing the day today, and a few other good colleagues and friends of mine. And this is one of those projects working on the Boston Globe a few years ago. This made me a reader of the publication. The Toast is a wonderful independent publisher. They publish some really beautiful work and writing on the web. And if you spend any amount of time on this new responsive design that we built, you're going to notice that there are changes not just at the page level, but individual parts of the design change and adapt at different rates as well. So the header or the masthead might change more frequently than content patterns that appear lower down on the page. I mention all this just as background, because the thing that I'd like to do is actually turn your attention to the design of the home page or the section fronts. Now, if you spend any amount of time on those pages, you're going to notice that there looks like a lot of content, right? They publish a ton of stuff. It's visually quite dense. But from a design and implementation standpoint, there's actually just a few different design patterns that go into building these complex-looking pages. And in fact, the one that I want to sort of turn you to is the real workhorse, which we started calling the teaser. In other words, what we're trying to do on these pages is actually tease content that the user might want to tap or click into. Articles, essays, what have you. And the teaser is a very simple, reusable pattern that we can spin up these pages very quickly from. And the teaser has a bunch of different permutations, right? It begins maybe in its most simple form as just a headline, very simple and concise. And maybe that headline is going to have an image associated with it. Or maybe it'll have a number attached to it to signify some sort of rank or significance. And then finally, the most prominent teasers are contained in the main content well, right? This is the real sort of like workhorse for the main content area. And it's when I was working on the teaser, as simple as it looks, that I started to reflect on some of the changes in my design process. Let me just walk you through that really quickly. So the main teaser that you see has a ton of extra information attached to that headline, right? It has some metadata associated with it. It has a comment count to show you how much activity has occurred on this particular article. And then there's a summary to actually just give you a sense of the content you're going to be committing to when you move into that page. Now, if I was going to be marking this up in HTML and CSS, back in the old days, 6 months ago, I'd probably look at this visual order and try to represent that more or less faithfully in the markup structure that I build for this one particular pattern. So I'd start at the top of the byline, and then the comment count, and then the article title, and then the summary. But then I caught myself, because I found myself asking a question that I've actually been trying to introduce at every step of my responsive design process, which is specifically, what if someone doesn't browse the web like I do? Now again, I use this at every stage of my process. I mean, this is a really great way of stepping out of my own assumptions and biases about how I encounter the web, and trying to remember that not everybody encounters the web in the same exact way. So as a visual designer, if I'm taking a design lead role on a project, let's say I'm working on a widescreen layout in something like Sketch or Photoshop. Well, this question, what if someone doesn't browse the web like I do, is a really great way of foregrounding the needs of the small screen user at the same time. Even though I might not be working on the same mock-up at the exact same moment, it's helpful to kind of keep that smaller screen content hierarchy in mind. So at least going back to this pattern, this structured markup pattern that we were building for the teaser, this is a really great reminder that not everybody is going to see the content as I might. If somebody's having this content read aloud to them in a speaking context, this is not necessarily the best way to structure this content, because the most important piece of information is actually a little bit buried in the HTML. The article headline is actually the third element in the teaser. And so in other words, if we were to follow the visual hierarchy and the content structure, we'd be leading with the byline, the meta information, which would be read out before the actual article title. And that would be kind of disorienting if the user can't actually see the layout. This, at least for me, was a little bit of a reminder that whenever possible, responsive designers should begin by thinking about the priority of the information they're designing, rather than just looking at the aesthetics of the layout in front of them. So in other words, with that in mind, I could sort of take a step back from the visuals of this one particular pattern, and instead think not just about the visual priority, but the content priority that I was actually trying to honor with this particular pattern. So rather than starting with the metadata, what is the most important piece of information inside of this teaser? It's not the byline, it's the article title. That's really the most important piece, and it's most visually prominent as well. From there, the second most important piece of information would be the byline or the category. And then finally, I actually decided that the summary was the third most important piece of information. And the least important piece of content in this particular pattern is the comment count. Even though it might be visually most prominent, anchored up in the right-hand corner of that module, it's actually the least important piece of information from a priority standpoint. So with that in mind, what I could do then is actually go back to the HTML and rethink some of my assumptions and actually come up with a markup structure that honors that content hierarchy. And I could apply some light styling from it, borrowing the type styles from the approved design, to actually get something visually rich in place that is structured the way that the content needs it to be. Now, if I was to show this to the client, I would be fired. This isn't the design that they approved, right? But I can basically use this as a foundation to create a more enhanced design up on top of it. So with this simple markup structure in place, what I can then do is that now that the article title and the byline are actually first, I can surround them with some sort of containing element in the HTML. Let's call it teaser head, that just bounds off the front matter in this particular pattern. And then with that in place, it's going to hold the article title and the byline in front of it. So with this in place, what I can then do is I can use a little bit of advanced CSS, namely the Flexbox property, to sort of change the gravity in that containing element. Specifically, I can use a property called flex direction column reverse, and what that ends up doing is it sort of like switches off the gravity. The byline floats up to the top, and the title sits at the bottom. Even though the content structure hasn't actually changed, the visual presentation has. Now, Flexbox is great. I'm not going to get too deep in the weeds on it today, given the time, but if I had multiple elements inside of that container, I could be really prescriptive about where they actually sit in the visual order. But unfortunately, Flexbox is really only good for elements that are contained within that particular element. It doesn't do anything for elements that sit way outside of it, like the comment count, which is at the very bottom. Ideally, what I'd like to do with this particular pattern is say that if a browser supports Flexbox, I want to take that comment count out of its default position and anchor it in the top right corner of the teaser. So to figure out if the browser actually supports Flexbox, what I actually need to do is ask the browser if it supports Flexbox. So what I then did was I wrote a little question in JavaScript. And I wrote this and I barely understand it, so don't worry, I'm not going to try to break this down. But basically all I'm doing is asking the browser if it supports certain features of the Flexbox property that I'm going to use in other parts of the design. So basically, if it answers yes, I am sufficiently capable of handling this layout, then the JavaScript is going to apply a class to the HTML element that says supports Flex. What this allows me to then do is I can quarantine more advanced layout rules in my CSS using that class. So I can apply the Flexbox layout conditionally, but also I can take the comment count out of its default position and position it absolutely in the top right corner of this particular module. In other words, what I'm doing is I'm starting from a baseline structure and layout that's served up to every browser on the planet, and it honors the content priority that the reader actually cares about. And then if a browser actually passes that little test that I wrote in JavaScript, I can take that comment count out of that position at the end of the summary and then enhance the layout conditionally. I can apply the Flexbox to change the order of the title and the byline, and then I can also take the comment count and stick it right up at the top. In other words, what I've done feels like twice as much work, right? I'm building two layouts, not one. But this, at least for me, was a really great reminder that supporting a browser doesn't necessarily mean that every single browser on the planet is going to get exactly the same experience. This way of thinking about the layered approach of our design patterns has been really at the heart of every big responsive design at scale over the last few years. The Guardian actually makes a significant amount of use of Flexbox and a lot of the layouts on their section fronts and home pages. Oh, hang on, sorry, I just got to fix one quick thing. Yeah, that's, no, we're just going to do that. Anyway, so you're welcome. So anyway, every one of those tight little layout grids that you see is actually generated with Flexbox, but this layout, as complex as it looks, is actually conditionally enhanced. They're running a simple little test in JavaScript, again, to sort of apply some classes to the document to say that, yes, this particular browser is modern enough to get this more complex layout. But if they fail that test, or maybe if the JavaScript doesn't actually reach them, they're still left with a baseline experience. The layout is going to be different, but they're still going to be able to access the same information and content and features that the Guardian readers actually need. I mention all of this because I think today, in 2016, a responsive design has to be device agnostic by default. Now, device agnostic is it's a wonderful sounding buzzword, said the guy who coined the term responsive design. But a friend of mine, Trent Walton, wrote an essay with this title, Device Agnostic, some years ago, talking about how this is actually a really powerful guiding design principle for him and his practice. And in the blog entry, he basically said that being responsive only begins with a flexible layout. We're dealing with hostile browsers, with tiny screens, with networks that are not nearly as fast as the ones that we use on a daily basis. And we're dealing with touch inputs and other kinds of input mechanisms as well. And he says that we need to hone in on the most adverse conditions of the web and build up from there. And he basically says that like cars designed to perform in extreme heat or on icy roads, and there are a few of those in my home state, websites should be built to face the reality of the web's inherent variability. And I think we forget sometimes that the web is not just the most flexible design medium ever, but it is an adverse medium. It is allergic to preserving the quality of our designs as they're being downloaded to our users' devices. You know, the network that we use to publish our work is more broadly accessed today than at any other point in its history, but it's also far slower and far more volatile than we might like to think, with the majority of the web's mobile data connections happening at sub-3G speeds. And is this something we're talking about when we're talking about the quality of good design for the web? Scott Gell had this really wonderful quote on Twitter some time ago saying that we don't disable JavaScript just to test how a site works with JavaScript disabled. It's not like any user really goes in and turns off JavaScript willingly. We do it to test how a site works in non-ideal net and browsing conditions. And I think more than ever before, we should, as designers and developers, be focusing on the non-ideal, asking ourselves these questions of what if somebody doesn't actually browse the web like I do? That could be the size or the quality of the screen, or it could be the quality of their network as well. Because we talk a lot about the quality of good design in ideal terms, right? The three most common words that I hear on every responsive design project are mobile, tablet, and desktop. Would anyone in the room like to guess what the three most unhelpful terms in talking about responsive design are? Because, I mean, they're not bad words, but they're broad words. If you were to ask any client or stakeholder or team member to define mobile or tablet or desktop, chances are every person in that room would give you a very different answer. And the problem with these words is that they conceal a lot of specific conditions or features that we might need to account for in our design practice, but the words kind of get in the way a little bit. So that's why a lot of my work actually tends to revolve around actually breaking clients out of the use of these words and stepping away from broad categories and instead focusing on the specific conditions and features that might directly impact their responsive designs. Now, depending on the project, this table might have more rows or might have fewer, but I've found it's usually generally pretty helpful to talk about the input method that the device has independent of the screen size, or the speed of the network independent of the quality of the network. Because again, if you hear the word mobile, you might tend to think of a bunch of features that fall down along the left-hand side of the table, right? It's a small touch screen that has maybe a slow and spotty network associated with it. But that doesn't necessarily account for analog devices, or it may not necessarily account for mobile devices that are connected to a wireless network on your office Wi-Fi for users that are actually stationary and not in motion. You know, and then on the other side of the spectrum, maybe the mobile user can't actually see the screen as you and I might. Maybe they're having the contents of a page read aloud to them in a speaking context. And then on the other side of the spectrum, we have desktop devices, right? Whatever that means. You know, again, stereotypically, we might think of a keyboard and mouse combination with somebody who's got fast and reliable Wi-Fi. Well, what if that laptop device is actually connected to a 3G antenna? You know, maybe they're tethering to a mobile phone. I mean, in Boston, there are thousands of people every day who commute into the city on commuter trains using Wi-Fi connections that are terrible. Those are effectively 3G antennas, even though they're reporting as wireless devices. So why don't we talk about the low bandwidth laptop experience? And then independently of that, you know, maybe that laptop is predominantly using a touchscreen on a newer model device. This kind of device independence is actually a really wonderful way of guiding the design of these responsive designs that we're working on today. You know, and in fact, when we were working on the Toast, this is actually something we started from. Because yes, we were working up to this high fidelity, top shelf design that we're going to be presenting to most modern browsers and devices. But we didn't want to forget about the adverse conditions of the web that we were publishing on. And so we wanted to make sure that if a browser wasn't modern enough, or maybe if a certain code asset didn't actually successfully download, we still wanted to give them something that was usable and accessible to ensure that any reader of the Toast, regardless of the capabilities of their device or their network, would be able to access the essays that they wanted. So whenever possible, I think if we can ask ourselves, what happens if somebody doesn't browse the web like I do, we should be designing more and more often for non-ideal scenarios. This kind of thinking is what kind of influenced every single design pattern that went into the responsive layouts that we used on the Toast. And so we repeated this process from the masthead to content wells to more robust pieces of functionality, and basically sort of thinking about what we were serving independent of the higher shelf design and moving up from there. I want to mention all this because I really think that building and designing a responsive design isn't the biggest challenge in front of us today. It's how we actually document and communicate a lot of the design decisions that go into these individual modules and pages that we have to share with other team members and with our clients. And so that's why in recent years, as responsive design's gotten more traction, I think we've been seeing a meteoric rise of the style guide being seen as kind of like the end result of responsive design. Now, maybe you call it a style guide. Pattern library is another really popular term for it. The English language is kind of terrible at this sort of thing. But whatever you call it, basically a style guide or pattern library is a really great way to sort of see how all the individual discrete bits of a responsive design work together to build those more complex layouts. Ushahidi is a really wonderful example of this. They develop open source software for data visualization and interactive mapping that's used worldwide. And so this is a fairly robust software platform, and they've published their style guide publicly online. So you can see everything building up from simple typographic elements to more complex forms and controls, and how this could actually be used to build and power other parts of their interface. And more organizations have quickly been publishing their style guides as they've been going responsive. And there are so many benefits to creating a pattern library internally. First and foremost, it creates a central or shared repository for all the front-end patterns and code that power your interface, that can be accessed by every single member of your team, not just developers. Because more importantly, it actually helps bridge a kind of collaboration gap between design and development. Over time, a pattern library actually becomes the first citizen of the design process, moving out of Photoshop and Illustrator and Sketch into the actual browsers and devices that we're designing for. And then it acts as a living document. And this is really key, because as your UI evolves and changes over time, the style guide should follow suit. And it helps with onboarding new team members as they're actually working. And then finally, and I think most importantly, it facilitates in-browser design, review, and testing. If you have some sort of visual regression tool, you can actually point it at your style guide to see where your UI might be changing across different builds of your application or product. Now, if you're interested in creating a style guide or a pattern library, there is basically sort of a simple three-step process to do so. It begins with a visual inventory, then a very rigorous process of naming and organizing all the different elements, and then finally translating your inventory into a living, breathing, HTML-driven style guide. So at a very high level, this is kind of what this process looks like for me, at least. The visual inventory basically begins by taking a look at the site you're about to redesign or the one that you've already redesigned. And as you're sort of browsing through it, you open up some sort of document that allows you to paste in screenshots, or maybe HTML, CSS, if that's how you prefer. And then what you start doing is you start looking for patterns. Now, you're not looking for every single instance of every link or every headline or every form element. You're looking for distinct treatments of them, the patterns that you've reused across the entire design system. Now, once you've actually completed this rigorous screen capping process, what you then do is actually name every single pattern in some sort of identifiable way. And you look for associations between patterns and try to group them under some sort of clear organization and labeling principle as well. And this is difficult to do, but incredibly important. And then finally, once you've actually established some sort of taxonomy, then there's a simple matter of producing the style guide. Now, for smaller pattern libraries, like we actually did for the Toast, this was a simple copy and paste product. We built a number of responsive pages, and we built it in a pattern-driven way, so we could sort of extract the patterns and produce a single page that the team could use to reference not just the visual presentation of the patterns, but the code that was underneath them as well. Now, if you're working on a larger product, I think it's actually worth investing in some of the automation and tooling out there to create some of these style guides automatically, because ultimately we want to create these style guides as though they're evergreen documents, so that they can change as our interfaces do in the live application. Because of time, I'd like to just refer you to an article that Susan Robertson wrote in A List Apart that does a really great job of sort of sharing some of the ways you can create an automated style guide as part of your product or service. I mention all of this because I think there's a lot of talk in our industry about this three-step process, but most of the emphasis tends to be on the first or the third step. The process that we use as teams to actually create that visual inventory And then we spend a lot of time actually talking about the tools and instrumentation needed to automate the production of these style guides. What I would actually argue, though, is that the most important step is actually the second one. It's the naming and organization we use to actually identify each one of these patterns and talk about them internally, and also how we group them as teams. Alla Kolmatova wrote this wonderful article for List Apart on the language of module design. And she basically said that an effective name for an element, or for an element's category, determines how that element will be used and helps to ensure that it's used consistently by everyone. And this is, at least for me, maybe one of the most fundamental benefits of working from a pattern library. As a quick example, let me tell you a very quick story about a boat. I'm good at non sequiturs. This is the Hokulea, and this is a large voyaging canoe that is basically only powered by the wind in its sails. And basically in 1976, it was used for an incredibly arduous journey, because the crew actually decided that they were going to travel between 2 points on the Pacific Ocean, specifically Hawaii and Tahiti. These are 2 island nations separated by some 2,500 miles. If you were to hop on a plane, it would take approximately 9.5 hours to get between the two. And it took the crew of the Hokulea about 30 days to travel between them. What was remarkable about the journey, however, wasn't just the distance. It's that they decided that they were going to do it without the aid of modern navigational equipment. They were only going to do it without maps, without compasses or sextants. In fact, basically with only analog and traditional Polynesian navigation techniques. They were able to do so because their master navigator was a man named Pius Mau Piailug, who was trained in some traditional navigation methods. And in fact, the most important instrument that was used in his navigational school was an instrument that didn't actually make it onto the boat with him. It's something called a star compass, which is an array of stones or shells, and it's a really beautiful instrument. I just want to show you a quick video of Mao actually using this in a training session. So that's just a brief excerpt from the video, but this is part of a navigation tradition that is millennia old. What he's actually using the star compass for is that in the center of the compass is the boat. And then what he's doing with that chant is he's actually naming every single one of the stars around it. In other words, he's actually trying to allow the navigators to orient using the sky around them and helping them to internalize the skies that they're actually going to be sailing under. And he's doing that through song, through a language that's been passed down through generation and generation. And this rote repetition of stars and their orientation around the boat allows every navigator, Trand and Mao's tradition, to actually make decisions on the fly, to make more intelligent decisions about the course of the boat as they're actually traveling on that journey. This kind of consistency and creating a shared understanding through language is something that I think we should be using our pattern libraries for in our responsive designs. Alla Kolmatova basically said that modularity might appear to be a simple concept at first, but making it work for your team demands significant effort and commitment. The biggest challenges around modularity aren't actually building these patterns in the browser. It's about establishing a team that knows when to reuse a module, or maybe when a module is a duplicate and needs to be removed, or helping them make good decisions about when a new module needs to be introduced and the pattern library is not actually working for them. Which is why it's important not to necessarily start our design process from patterns, but from the language that we're actually using to build these interfaces internally as client teams or as organizations. Now, one of the most common ways of naming and organizing some of these elements tends to fall around this methodology called atomic design. This has been getting a lot of popularity in recent years. It's a methodology that was popularized by Brad Frost, and it's a really wonderful metaphor for visualizing how complex elements can be built up from much smaller ones. But in some of the client organizations that I've worked with in recent years, this very rich chemistry metaphor can introduce some organizational friction. So let's say, for example, you're actually breaking a responsive design down into its component patterns. So looking at, for example, a search module that is a flexible element, it's above a certain breakpoint, and that is smaller ones, it's a collapsible one. Now, if you were going to sort of assign this a position in the atomic design metaphor, it's pretty apparent that this isn't a full page or a full template, and it's not an individual atom, the most discrete element. This is somewhere in the middle. So this sort of begs the question, is this a molecule or is this an organism in the atomic design parlance? So for a lot of organizations, they were able to solve this problem pretty easily, but this also introduces kind of a scaling problem in language, right? Every member of your team might answer this question differently about where this particular module falls in this hierarchy. Now, maybe for your team or organization, atomic design works perfectly, but at least for me, the success or failure of any given style guide really depends on the language that we use to talk about it, the words that we use to talk about the placement of these patterns in the overall hierarchy, and how they can be used accordingly. So regardless of the teams you use, whether it's atoms and molecules or components and blocks, before you commit to a metaphor or to a naming system, it's important to ensure that every single member of your team or your organization shares the same level of understanding about each of those labels. In other words, I think the best style guides or pattern libraries that I've seen in recent years use metaphors and terminology that was actually invented by the team that's going to be maintaining them, which actually provides a much more sustainable platform for responsive design over time. So I've been citing Alla Kolmatova's article incredibly frequently, and I can't recommend reading it enough, because it's a really wonderful process breakdown in this article about how you can actually start from a collaborative review to look at every single module in your design system, and then as a team actually come up with a naming system for it. And the best part about this is it helps you actually identify where redundancies might fall in your design system. She talks about one conflict that came out of the design review where they noticed two modules that had similar purposes but were designed independently of each other. And so what they could do by talking about this conflict, they could focus in on the higher level shared goal that both of these modules have and come up with a replacement for both of them that stylistically was similar, but it was no longer limited by a position in the layout or by the kinds of content inside that particular module. By doing these more collaborative reviews, what it allows you to do is move beyond just simple styles and patterns and actually integrate your design system into every part of your company culture. And when you're building these responsive layouts, it has some very tangible benefits. It helps you define a CSS architecture at a very early stage in the design process. So as you're actually naming these elements, the development and engineering team can actually start thinking about the names of these elements as they exist in the front-end patterns. It helps involve more users in the design process as well. And finally, it allows the entire team to become gatekeepers of the modular system you're actually designing. It better empowers them to identify redundancies in the design, and also helps them talk about this in the shared language so they can make recommendations about when elements need to adapt and change as well. Because the end goal isn't just a style guide or a pattern library. It's about evolving a language of design principles that you and your team can use to extend your design system over time. Vox Media, for example, has been practicing pattern-driven responsive design for quite some time now across a number of their different brands and publications, and they do really beautiful responsive work. But what they've been sharing now isn't just front-end tips and design practices. Instead, they've actually been talking about the principles that they use to interrogate new patterns as they introduce new brands or new modules into their design systems. Are elements unique enough? Are they reusable enough? Do they have enough sense of statefulness that's communicated to the user? Or are they sufficiently responsive to warrant inclusion in the modules? Airbnb also has a fairly well-codified set of design principles that they use to talk about the design of their responsive product as well as their native applications. And they can basically, as they're looking at these new modules and design patterns, sort of ask themselves, is something universal and unified enough? Does it actually feel like it's part of a greater whole? Does it work across devices? Is it iconic and conversational enough for our brand? By going through this process, by building up out of patterns and eventually moving up to a larger design principle language, you're going to be in a better position to make judgments about how your responsive design needs to evolve over time. It really is a compass that can guide our responsive efforts. Because at the end of the day, I don't have an answer for where we're going next or what's going to happen to the web in the next few years. But what I do know is the web doesn't actually evolve in a single straight line, a relentless cycle of upgrades of hardware and software. Because yes, we've been seeing all these wonderful changes as we move further and further beyond the desktop. But it's worth noting that, for example, explosive mobile growth hasn't, by and large, come at the expense of desktop devices. This tends to be additive rather than reductive. The desktop hasn't disappeared. And while tablets have been incredibly popular over recent years, there's been a lot of market analysis to suggest that tablet sales are actually flatlining, if not declining, on a year-over-year basis. And while a lot of people are really excited about wearable devices and smart TVs, it's also worth noting that all that investment hasn't produced a single viable alternative to mobile computing or desktop computing, not quite yet. And what's more, our definition of mobile is entirely too narrow in more developed markets. Looking at all the photos that have been coming out of the Syrian refugee crisis, one of the greatest humanitarian crises of our time, one of the major through lines throughout all of those photos are mobile devices and chargers and portable hotspots. And these devices are used to help guide safe journey from one arduous end of a journey to another and to connect with people along that journey. But all these mobile phones aren't like the ones that you and I might be using. They're far less powerful, they're much less expensive, but they're still able to access the same web that you and I are designing for today. So that's why the conversation on the web has been turning more and more toward the next billion people who are going to be coming online and how they're not going to be coming from more developed economies like the United States and Western Europe. And a researcher and designer once said that some of the next billion to come online are taking boats across the Mediterranean, the South China Sea, and elsewhere. They will have smartphones. And I think that responsive design, paired with device-agnostic design principles and driven by smart, reusable patterns, are absolutely going to help us solve some of the challenges that we don't know about us in front of us today. And by doing so, they're going to help us reach more people than ever before. So let's design for them. That seems like a good start to set our ship by. With that, I'd like to thank you very much for your time.